The winter of 1993 in Moscow was cruel and unforgiving. Snow fell endlessly, covering the broken asphalt, the rusted playgrounds, the gray concrete blocks that stretched across the city like scars of a forgotten empire. People walked quickly, collars up, eyes down, avoiding both the cold and the gaze of strangers. It was a time when trust was expensive, and betrayal was cheap. And somewhere in the heart of that restless city, a new empire of the underworld was being born. I was 19 when I first crossed paths with the Last Bratva. They weren't the biggest crew in Moscow, not yet, but they were ruthless and hungry. The collapse of the Soviet Union had opened doors for everyone. Businessmen, dreamers, thieves, and killers alike. The government was weak, the police were corrupt, and the streets belonged to those who had the guts to take them. For the Orlovskaya, that meant protection rackets, stolen cars, smuggling, and the kind of violence that left entire neighborhoods trembling. My entry into their world was almost accidental. My father had been a factory worker, a proud man who suddenly found himself unemployed when the machines went silent and the gates closed forever. We had nothing. My mother sold cigarettes at the metro, and I sold myself to survival. It started small, fake Levi's jeans on the corner, packs of Marlboros from Poland, bottles of cheap cognac hidden under my coat. One night, a group of older men stopped me as I was hawking near the entrance to Taganka. They weren't cops, though they looked more dangerous than any cop I'd ever seen. Leather jackets, shaved heads, heavy gold chains, and eyes that could cut you open. "You selling without Krisha, kid?" one of them asked, exhaling cigarette smoke into my face. I didn't even know what Krisha meant back then. The word literally meant roof. But on the streets it was protection, the shield of the Mafia. Without it, you were nobody, and worse, you were prey. I stammered something about just trying to make a living. They laughed, not cruelly, but like wolves circling a rabbit. That night, instead of breaking my legs, they handed me a job. A small one, carrying envelopes, making deliveries, collecting a few debts. I said yes. What else could I do? It was either that or starve. And just like that, I became part of something far bigger, something darker. The Orlovskaya were run by a man everyone called Dead, the grandfather. His real name was Arkady Orlov, a veteran of Afghanistan, a man who had seen death and carried it in his eyes like a permanent shadow. He wasn't the kind of boss who shouted or waved guns around. No, he was worse. He was calm, measured, and when he gave an order, men died without question. Around him were his lieutenants, Viktor Kosowy with his lazy eye, Misha Belayai, who wore only white suits, and Sergei Tatar, whose blade was faster than most men could blink. At first, I was nothing to them, a skinny kid who ran errands. But in the streets of Moscow, the 1990s were an education you didn't get from books. I learned quickly how to spot plainclothes cops, how to tell if someone was carrying a weapon, how to collect money without losing your teeth. I also learned about fear, the kind that seeped into your bones when you walked into a bar with a baseball bat, knowing some man behind the counter would either pay up or get his skull cracked open. But the more time I spent with them, the more I understood that it wasn't just about money. It was about power. In those days, money bought you food, cars, women, but power bought you life. And Dead understood power better than anyone. He had a vision. The Orlovskaya weren't going to be street thugs forever. While other gangs fought over kiosks and car markets, Dead whispered about banks, oil companies, politicians. He told us that the future wasn't in the alleys, it was in the boardrooms. But to get there, first we had to win the streets. And that meant war. War came quickly. Another gang, the Krasnogorsky, decided they wanted the same territory, the same markets, the same protection money. It started with broken windows and burned cars, but within weeks, bodies began turning up in dumpsters, throats cut, bullets in the back of the head. Moscow police looked the other way, as long as their envelopes were thick enough. Sometimes they even rented out their weapons to us. Kalashnikovs that disappeared from the evidence room, grenades that somehow found their way into our trunks. I remember my first real work. It was a cold February evening, the snow black from exhaust fumes. Viktor Kosowy handed me a Tokarev pistol and told me we were going to pay a visit to a man who refused to pay his dues. His name was Lev, owner of a small electronics shop. He thought he could hide behind some ex-cop friends. Thought the Orlovskaya wouldn't dare touch him. He was wrong. We walked into his shop as the neon lights flickered above the dirty windows. Lev froze when he saw us, his hands shaking. I could hear his wife and daughter in the back, whispering. Kosoe didn't waste time. He grabbed Lev by the collar and slammed him against the counter. You think Dead's word means nothing? You think you can spit on the Bratva? He snarled. My job was to stand at the door, pistol heavy in my hand, sweat dripping despite the cold. I was terrified, not of Lev, of myself. Because when I looked at him, eyes wide with fear, I realized something had shifted inside me. The boy who sold cigarettes at the metro was gone. In his place was someone else, someone darker. Kosoe beat Lev until his face was unrecognizable. Then he turned to me. Your turn, he said, tossing me the pistol. My hands shook as I pointed it at Lev, who was barely conscious. Shoot the wall, Kosoe ordered. Show him we're serious. I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small shop. The bullet tore into the plaster, missing Lev's head by inches. His wife screamed in the back, and Lev collapsed, sobbing, promising to pay, promising anything. When we left, Kosoe slapped me on the back. Welcome to the Bratva, kid, he said with a grin. And just like that, there was no turning back. That night, as I walked through the empty streets, the snow crunching under my boots, I felt both alive and dead at the same time. Alive because I had power now, the kind I'd never known. Dead because I knew I'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The Orlovskaya grew fast. We took over markets, car dealerships, nightclubs. We had men in the police, in the city council, even in the banks. But with growth came enemies, and with enemies came blood. Every week, someone was shot in the street, a car exploded, a body was dumped in the Moskva River. And in the middle of it all, I kept rising, from errand boy to soldier, from soldier to something more. Dead noticed me. One night, he called me into his office, a dark room filled with smoke, the smell of vodka heavy in the air. He looked at me with those cold, unreadable eyes. You've got guts, kid, he said quietly. But guts aren't enough. You need brains. You need loyalty. You ready to give me that? I nodded, though in truth, I didn't know if I was ready. Dead smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. Good, he said. Because the future is ours, and I need men I can trust. And so began my real descent into the heart of the Russian Mafia, a world where brotherhood and betrayal walked hand in hand, where life was cheap and power was priceless. The first time I saw a man die in front of me, it was spring of 1994. Moscow was thawing, the snow turning to black slush, the air thick with exhaust and cheap gasoline. We were sent to a nightclub near Sokolniki, a gaudy place filled with flashing lights, loud music, and women who laughed too easily. It was run by a man named Igor Shmel, a wasp, skinny, restless, always buzzing. He had refused to pay his share to Dead, claiming he had his own krisha. We came in 6 men deep, leather jackets creaking, cigarettes burning between our lips. The bass from the music shook the floor as we walked through the crowded club. People moved aside, sensing something bad was about to happen. Kosoe led the way, his lazy eye searching the crowd like a predator. Shmel was sitting at a table in the back, surrounded by girls and cheap champagne. He looked up when we approached, his smile fading. Boys, he said, forcing a laugh. No need for trouble. We're all businessmen here. Kosoe didn't bother with words. He pulled out a Makarov and shot Shmel in the chest, point blank. The sound of the gunshot cut through the music, leaving only screams and chaos. The girls scattered, bottles crashed to the floor, people dove for cover. I stood frozen, the smoke from the gun curling in the air. Blood spread across Shmel's white shirt, his eyes wide in disbelief. He gasped once, twice, then slumped forward, face down on the table. It was over in seconds. Kosoe turned to me, calm as ever. This is how it works, he said. You either pay or you die. Remember that. We walked out like nothing had happened, leaving the club in ruins, the music still echoing faintly behind us. Outside, the night was cold, silent, almost peaceful. I lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the smoke burning my throat. I realized then that life in the Bratva was simple, brutal, and absolute. There were no second chances. After that, my place in the Orlovskaya was cemented. I was no longer just a kid carrying envelopes. I was part of the machine, a soldier of Dead's empire. And the empire was growing fast. By 1995, we controlled half the markets in Moscow. Car dealerships, construction companies, even banks were under our krisha. We collected millions in protection money, laundered it through nightclubs and casinos, and invested it into oil and aluminum. The chaos of the Soviet collapse had left everything up for grabs, and Dead was grabbing faster than anyone. But with success came enemies. The Krasnogorsky weren't gone. They were regrouping, allying with other crews, bringing in mercenaries from Chechnya. The city became a battlefield. Car bombs exploded in broad daylight. Drive-by shootings sprayed bullets across busy streets. Ordinary people lived in fear, but for us, it was just business. I remember a night in late autumn when Dead called a meeting in a small dacha outside Moscow. We gathered in a smoke-filled room, the table heavy with vodka bottles, plates of pickled herring, and black bread. Dead sat at the head, silent, his fingers drumming against the wood. Finally, he spoke. The Krasnogorsky are moving on our territory. They think we're weak. They think we can be pushed aside. They are wrong. He looked around the room, his eyes hard as steel. From tonight, it is war. No mercy, no hesitation. You see them, you kill them. The room erupted in cheers, fists slamming the table, glasses raised in toasts. My stomach turned. I had seen blood, I had seen death, but this was different. This was war. And war came. The streets of Moscow turned red that winter. Every week, someone from our crew or theirs was buried. Funerals became routine. Black cars, crying widows, priests mumbling prayers while men with cold eyes watched from the shadows. We carried coffins and swore revenge, even as we wondered who would carry ours next. I was sent on jobs I never imagined I could survive. We ambushed cars on the highway, spraying bullets from Kalashnikovs. We stormed apartments, dragging men out in their underwear, beating them until they gave us names, addresses, secrets. I became numb to it, my hands stained with blood that never seemed to wash away. One night, after a particularly brutal shootout near the Koroshevo market, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was thinner, my eyes darker, older. I was 21, but I felt like I had lived a lifetime. The phone rang. It was Dead's lieutenant, Misha Belayai. "Pack your bags," he said. "We're going to St. Petersburg. Business. Business." That word could mean anything. A negotiation, a killing, a deal with politicians. I didn't ask questions. I just obeyed. That was the only way to survive. When we arrived in St. Petersburg, the city felt different. Colder, darker, more dangerous. The gangs there were even more brutal, the alliances more fragile. We met in a smoky restaurant by the river, men in suits sipping vodka, guns hidden under their jackets. Deals were made, promises exchanged, envelopes slid across the table. I watched Dead work, calm and patient, like a chess player moving pieces on a board only he could see. He talked about aluminum plants, shipping routes, banks. He talked about the future. I realized then that Dead wasn't just a gangster. He was a king, building an empire in the ashes of a fallen nation. And I, somehow, had become one of his knights. The trip to St. Petersburg lasted longer than expected. What was supposed to be a week stretched into months. The Orlovskaya were making moves, buying into shipping companies, taking over customs offices at the port. It was a gold mine, cigarettes from Europe, alcohol, stolen cars from Germany, even weapons flowing in from the Balkans. Everything passed through the docks, and whoever controlled them controlled a fortune. Dead struck a deal with one of the local crews, the Malashevskaya. They were vicious, unpredictable, but they knew the territory. In return for our support, they let us in on the port business. It wasn't a peaceful partnership, but it was profitable. Money flowed faster than vodka at a wedding. I remember the nights spent in restaurants with heavy curtains drawn, the tables covered with caviar, cognac, stacks of rubles. Politicians joined us sometimes, smiling as they accepted envelopes, pretending not to notice the guns under our coats. Judges, prosecutors, even police colonels toasted to our health. Everyone wanted a piece. And Dead gave it, carefully, strategically. He was building not just a gang, but an empire that reached from Moscow to St. Petersburg and beyond. But the more powerful we became, the more dangerous the game grew. Rivals appeared everywhere. Chechen groups hungry for blood and profit, Georgian thieves with old prison connections, local brigades unwilling to bow to us. Every meeting could turn into an ambush, every toast into a last drink. It was in Petersburg that I took my first real life. Until then, I had been part of violence, yes, but never the one pulling the trigger in the moment of truth. That changed on a cold November night. We were sent to handle a problem. A mid-level gangster named Ruslin who had stopped paying his dues. Dead said he was talking to the Chechens, planning to switch sides. Betrayal was worse than debt. Betrayal meant death. We found him outside a small bathhouse, his breath rising in the icy air. He looked surprised when he saw us, then scared when he realized there were no words that could save him. Kosoe handed me the pistol without a word. My heart raced, my palms slick with sweat. Ruslin looked at me, his eyes wide. "Please, brother," he whispered. In that moment, everything slowed. I thought about my father, about the boy I used to be, about the line I had already crossed. There was no going back. I raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the frozen night. Ruslin fell, a dark stain spreading across the snow. I stood there, numb, as the steam of his last breath vanished into the air. Kosoe clapped me on the shoulder. "Now you're one of us," he said. But I didn't feel like one of them. I felt hollow, as if a piece of my soul had been carved away. Yet the Bratva didn't care about souls. It cared about loyalty, strength, and fear. And I had proven I was willing to do what had to be done. When we returned to Moscow, I was no longer a soldier. I was a trusted man, close to Dead himself. He gave me responsibilities, overseeing markets, collecting from businessmen, even negotiating small deals. I learned to dress better, to drink slower, to speak less. Dead always said, "The less you say, the more they fear you." By 1996, our influence was everywhere. Nightclubs, oil, banks, casinos. We had our hands in everything. The Orlovskaya name carried weight. When we walked into a room, people stood, not out of respect, but out of fear. Fear was more reliable than respect. But the wars didn't stop. They only grew bloodier. The Krasnogorsky were nearly destroyed, but the Chechens took their place. They were fierce, unafraid of death, willing to die for honor. They planted bombs under our cars, kidnapped our men, executed them on videotape. Dead responded with equal brutality. Whole buildings went up in flames, families torn apart in the name of vengeance. Moscow was drowning in blood, and the government barely pretended to care. I began to lose track of the funerals. Too many friends, too many brothers buried in the cold ground. I drank more, slept less, and felt the walls closing in. Every time I got into a car, I checked under the seat for wires. Every time I walked into a cafe, I scanned the room for shooters. Paranoia wasn't a sickness, it was survival. And then came the night that changed everything. It was January 1997. The snow fell heavy, muffling the sounds of the city. Dead had arranged a meeting with a businessman named Sokolov, owner of a construction company. Sokolov was stubborn, refusing to pay for our krisha. Dead wanted him convinced. We met in a small restaurant near the Arbat. The lights were dim, the air thick with smoke. I sat beside Dead, across from Sokolov, who looked nervous but defiant. Dead poured vodka for everyone, his hands steady. "Sokolov," he said calmly, "you're a smart man. You know how Moscow works. You want your business to grow, you need protection. My protection. Without it, accidents happen." Sokolov swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to me, then back to Dead. "I can't," he said quietly. "I already have protection." The room went silent. Dead's smile faded. He leaned forward, his voice low. dangerous.
Who?
Sokolov hesitated. The Chechens, he whispered. For a moment, time stopped. Then Ded sat back, his expression cold. You made your choice, he said. He stood, signaling to us. Let's go. We left the restaurant in silence. The snow crunched under our boots, the night air sharp as a blade. Ded lit a cigarette, the glow illuminating his face. Kill him, he said softly, as if ordering dessert. That was the beginning of a new war, one fiercer than anything before. A war that would swallow us whole. The winter of 1997 bled into spring with no promise of peace. Moscow was restless, like a wounded animal, and everyone knew something terrible was coming. The Chechen crews had grown bold, cutting into our markets, attacking our men in broad daylight. They didn't fear us the way the smaller gangs did. They had their own code, their own discipline. To them, death was just another part of life. Ded despised them, not only for their violence but because they were unpredictable. A Russian gangster could be bought, bribed, or threatened. A Chechen either took your money or took your life. The night after the meeting with Sokolov, he was found shot in the head in the stairwell of his apartment block. No witnesses, no arrests, just another body in a city drowning in them. His death lit the fuse. The Chechens struck first, ambushing one of our convoys near the Leningrad highway. 3 of our men were killed, their car riddled with bullets, set ablaze for everyone to see. It was a message. Ded responded the only way he knew, blood for blood. Within a week, 2 Chechen safe houses were hit, their men executed in their sleep. I was there for one of those hits. We stormed a shabby apartment in the dead of night, masks over our faces, Kalashnikovs in our hands. The smell of stale smoke and sweat filled the air as we kicked the door down. A man inside reached for a weapon, but I cut him down before he could fire. Bullets ripped through the thin walls, screams echoed in the darkness. By the time it was over, the place was painted red, bodies sprawled on the floor, silence settling like dust. When we returned to our cars, my hands were trembling. I stared at the blood on my boots, wondering if it would ever come off. Kosoi laughed, lighting a cigarette. Get used to it, kid, he said. This is war, and war doesn't care about your conscience. But deep down, I knew I was changing. Every time I pulled the trigger, a piece of me disappeared. Yet the Bratva rewarded me. Ded himself called me into his office, poured me a glass of vodka, and told me I had proven my worth. He spoke of trust, of loyalty, of a future where I would command men of my own. His words were heavy, binding. In the Bratva, once you had blood on your hands, there was no way back to innocence. By summer, the streets of Moscow felt like a battlefield. Car bombs tore through markets, snipers waited on rooftops, grenades exploded in restaurants. Civilians tried to pretend life was normal, shopping, working, marrying, but everyone lived with the knowledge that a stray bullet could end it all. Newspapers printed stories of businessmen gunned down in traffic, of politicians assassinated outside their homes. Most people didn't know who was fighting who, only that the war was everywhere. Inside the Bratva, paranoia grew. Ded trusted few, and even among us there were whispers of betrayal. Some of our men were tempted by the Chechens' money, others by their promise of power. Loyalty was tested every day. I learned to keep my circle small, my secrets closer. One night, Ded invited me to his dacha outside Moscow. The air was heavy with pine and the distant hum of insects. Inside, the table was set with food and vodka, but Ded barely touched it. He smoked one cigarette after another, his face hidden in shadow. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice low. "Better than most." "Thank you, Ded," I said, not knowing what else to say. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "But I need more from you. Times are changing. The Bratva must change too. This war with the Chechens, it's not just about territory. It's about survival. If we lose, we disappear. If we win, we own Moscow." I nodded, though fear coiled in my stomach. Ded's gaze lingered on me, as if he was measuring my soul. "I want you close to me," he said. "Not just a soldier. A man I can trust with everything." I felt both pride and dread. To be close to dead was an honor, but it was also a death sentence. The closer you stood to the fire, the more likely you were to burn. Still, I had no choice. I had chosen this path, and it had chosen me in return. Weeks later, I understood what dead meant. A mole had been discovered inside our ranks, a man named Pavel, who had been feeding information to the Chechens. He had been with us for years, laughing, drinking, fighting alongside us. His betrayal cut deep. Dead ordered him dealt with, and he chose me for the job. We found Pavel in a cheap hotel near the Ring Road. He looked surprised when I entered the room, then resigned. He didn't beg, didn't deny it. He just sat on the bed, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "It was just business," he said quietly. Business. That word again, so empty and cruel. I raised the pistol, my hand steady now, no longer the trembling boy I once was. Pavel looked me in the eye, and for a moment I saw myself reflected there. The same hunger, the same fear. Then I pulled the trigger. When I reported back, Dead placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Now you understand," he said. "In this life, loyalty is everything. Without it, we are nothing." From that night, I was no longer just a soldier. I was Dead's man, trusted, feared, marked. My rise was fast, almost dizzying. I had money, cars, women, power. But I also had enemies everywhere. Every day could be my last. By 1998, the war had reached its peak. Moscow was bleeding, but so was the Orlovskaya. Too many funerals, too many betrayals. Dead grew older, his face lined with fatigue, though his mind remained sharp. He spoke less, watched more, as if waiting for something none of us could see. And then came the crash, the financial crisis that tore through Russia, leaving businesses bankrupt, banks empty, people starving. For the Bratva, it was both a curse and an opportunity. Men lost fortunes overnight, but Dead had planned for it. While others stumbled, he seized control of assets for pennies, tightening his grip on the city. But the Chechens didn't stop. If anything, they grew stronger, feeding off the chaos. The war raged on, and I found myself deeper in blood than ever before. Sometimes, late at night, I would stare at the ceiling of my apartment, the city humming outside, and wonder how much longer I could last. Every knock at the door made my heart race. Every ringing phone could mean death. I drank too much, slept too little, and felt the weight of ghosts pressing down on me. Yet when morning came, I put on the suit, lit the cigarette, and played my part. Because in Moscow of the 1990s, there was no way out. You either ruled or you died. The city in 1998 lived on a taut wire. Moscow looked like it was frozen between what had been and what might be. Glossy new shop windows and Western cars glittered on the surface, but beneath that sheen the blood still swirled. For ordinary people, the 90s were a nightmare. For us, it was an arena. Every day decided who would remain on top and who would end up in the ground. After Pavel, after the hit, it felt like we had crossed a line. Dead gathered us more and more often, at his dacha, in guarded restaurants, and his words grew heavier. His calm eyes were never the same. Now there was a constant shadow of worry in them. He knew our world was cracking. Too many enemies, too few truly loyal men. We sat around long tables, drank too much, chewed cold meat, and he would say slowly, weighing each syllable, "We need order. We need rules. If we don't hold ourselves together, they will eat us alive." That was the bitter truth. Cracks had appeared in the Bratva. Some left to join the Chechens. Some tried to run their own schemes without sharing the common pot. In the 90s, that meant one thing: death. Killing an outsider is one thing. Killing your own brother cuts deeper, but it had to be done. The first message came in the summer. One of our old fighters, Seryoga they called him Bear, was found in his car on the outskirts. 2 bullets to the head, hands tied. A note left in the glove compartment. This is what happens to those who play both sides. No one doubted who had done it. The Chechens were sending signs. Dead threw a photo of the corpse on the table and said, "He got greedy. He sold weapons without telling us. He thought he'd be smarter than everyone. This is what happens." We were quiet. Respect for Dead was like a law. No one questioned him aloud. But a chill settled over us. Anyone who put personal gain above the brotherhood would meet the same fate. The war with the Chechens became personal. They didn't just muscle in on small markets. They started pushing into things we considered our heart: casinos, restaurants, currency exchanges. Explosions rang out downtown, and every new corpse tightened the knot. Ordinary life became facade. The city had gone to war. One night we learned that a Chechen boss, a man named Ramzan, would be at a restaurant on Kutuzovsky. It was a chance. Dead picked 10 of his best, including me. We drove in silence. Tires whispered on wet asphalt, and fear sat in our mouths like a bitter pill. I felt the old animal part of me wake, the part that had learned to measure a man by how he stood when the gunfire began. The restaurant was full. Rich men, officials, girls in cheap dresses. Ramzan sat surrounded by his guards, laughing, drinking cognac. Dead locked eyes with him. The next moments were a blur. Machine guns roared, tables flew, glass and blood sprayed the walls. I fired at one of the guards, saw Ramzan lurch, then slip away like a shadow, disappearing into the chaos. We failed to get him. Morning papers screamed about the carnage. Officials promised tough measures, but we knew what those words were worth. For us, it tasted of failure. The war had gone open, and Moscow would never be the same. After that, gunfire became ordinary. Drivers checked rearview mirrors with every light change. People avoided sitting with their backs to the door. We lived in that reality. It was the only air we breathed. Dead grew harder, trusting fewer every day. On one meeting, he looked straight at me and said, "You are my eyes and ears. If someone plans betrayal, I must know first." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I understood. I would have to watch the very men I called brothers. Suspicion fell first on Victor Kosowy, the same man who had taught me to shoot and had laughed when I trembled after my first kill. He began disappearing more often. His phone calls shortened. His eyes looked worked and wet. I reported it. Dead's answer was a nod. "Watch him. Don't rush. Spying on your own is like cutting into living flesh." Victor had been almost a brother. I waited for him one night as he came home late. He froze when he saw me, then forced a sad smile. "Brother," he said, "it's not what you think." His voice was hollow. I saw the truth in his eyes. No fear, only exhaustion. He wanted out. "Tell Dead I never wanted a war," he whispered. "But we can't live like this anymore." I shot him twice. He fell at my feet, and with him a piece of me died. When I returned, Dead poured me a glass and said, "Now you're real. Remember, pity is a luxury." After that, I stopped being the boy who once hawked cigarettes at the metro. Moscow had turned into a chessboard, and we were pieces moved by Dead's hands. Winter slid into fall, and it was clear. Without a large, decisive meeting, one big strelka, there was no future. The war had exhausted everyone, including us. The city demanded a solution. The authorities would not intervene. Who would pay them to care? So an agreement was set. In an old hangar on the outskirts, leaders from both sides would meet, guns masked under coats, to try and divide the city without spilling everything. I will never forget that night. 50 of our men, guns loaded, faces stony. An equal number of Chechens opposite us, their eyes cold as river ice. Dead walked forward, and so did Ramzan, 2 old wolves smelling blood. Dead spoke with the flat certainty of a man who had seen too much. "Enough blood. Moscow's too small for this war. Let's divide it fairly." Ramzan laughed, showing a gold tooth. "Fair? You think I came here to be fair? You old men have no future. Moscow will be ours." Those words hung in the cold like a knife. I understood then that there would be no peace. Words would not save us. At the slightest hesitation, the hangar would become a graveyard. Men shifted, fingers tightened on triggers. I felt my own pulse thud against my ribs. Dead's voice was steady. "We can share markets, ports, certain businesses. But we set lines. Cross them and it means war." Ramzan spat. "Lines are written in blood." The air split with a shot. one of the Chechens, a nervous kid, had fired. The hangar erupted. Bullets smashed into metal, screams ricocheted, men fell. The plan for a controlled division dissolved in seconds. When the smoke cleared, both sides had heavy losses. Friends, fighters, men who had sat across from me at the same table now lay bleeding on concrete. The hangar reeked of cordite and iron. Dead staggered, hand pressed to his side. Ramzan had vanished in the storm of bodies. That night changed everything. The city went into open chaos. The fragile balance we had tried to build collapsed. The Orlovskaya began to lose ground. Men we had trusted vanished, killed, turned, or bought. Dead's calm started to crack. The mask slipped now and then. He had always been a patient man, but the strain showed. He started giving orders less, and watching more. He was a general without an army he could trust entirely. I rose as Dead's shadow, trusted, feared, necessary. I took men, reclaimed small pockets of territory, arranged hits, collected debts. But with each victory something inside me eroded. There were fewer laughs, more cold coffee, fewer nights when sleep felt like a mercy. I learned the number of my enemies by their scars, learned to trust a man by the way he swallowed his vodka. When the financial storm hit later that year and the ruble collapsed, everything shifted. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated. For some it was ruin. For Dead it was a chance. He moved fast, buying up assets at fire sale prices, securing control over companies and properties that would later feed the clan. In the chaos of falling markets, he tried to turn us into something more than killers, into businessmen with armored cars and legal fronts. But the Chechens would not be bought off, and a new generation of rivals rose. Men who learned how to slip between the legal world and the underworld without getting their hands soiled. Late at night, I would lie awake and listen to the city hum, counting the ghosts. Each knock on a door, each anonymous call could be the end. I drank to dull the memory, but the images returned. The faces of men I had killed, the ones I had watched die, the funerals that became routine. Yet every morning I dressed, lit a cigarette, tightened my tie, and stepped back into the light. Because in Moscow of the 90s there were only two options, rule or be buried. And for now, I chose to rule. The winter of 1999 pressed down on Moscow like a shroud. The city was tired. The people were tired. Even the gangsters were tired. The war had dragged on too long, too bloody, too costly. Streets that once pulsed with ambition now smelled of fear and resignation. Businessmen hid behind tinted windows. Politicians took bribes just to stay alive, and the police had long stopped pretending they controlled anything. Dead was not the same man anymore. The years had caught him, and so had the blood. His face, once sharp with command, now sagged with exhaustion. He sat for hours in silence, staring at his glass of vodka, chain-smoking until the ashtray overflowed. His voice, once thunder, had become gravel. He still gave orders, but they were slower, cautious. Some of the younger men whispered behind his back, calling him weak, a relic of the old ways. I was his shadow, but even I could see it. The Orlovskaya was cracking. Some crews defected, some were killed, some simply vanished. The Chechens kept pressing, hungrier than ever, and a new wave of organized men, slick, educated, suited in Armani, started carving their own empires. They weren't like us. They didn't spill blood in restaurants. They moved through banks, through oil companies, through politics. They bought the future while we were still bleeding in the streets. One night, Dead called me to his dacha. Snow covered the pines, and the air bit like knives. Inside, the house was warm but dim, shadows flickering from the fireplace. He poured us both vodka but didn't drink his. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "You know what I see?" he asked quietly. "I see the end. Not just mine. Ours." I didn't answer. He studied me with tired eyes, as if searching for the boy I once had been. "You've done everything I asked. More. You've been loyal when others weren't. But loyalty doesn't save us from time. The streets will eat us all. The Bratva, it's dying." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But I knew he was right. The Moscow of the 90s was burning out. and the world ahead belonged to different predators. Days later, it happened. We were ambushed near the river, Chechens, heavily armed, waiting for us. The night lit up with gunfire, bullets carving through metal and flesh. I returned fire, shouting orders, dragging wounded men into cover. Beside me, Dead stood tall, firing until his magazine clicked empty. Then a round caught him in the chest. He staggered, dropped to his knees, blood spilling like dark wine into the snow. I carried him into the car, screaming at the driver to go. His breath was shallow, his face pale, but his eyes locked on mine. He gripped my hand with the last of his strength. "Don't be like me," he rasped. "Don't let it own you." And then he was gone. We buried him in silence, no fanfare, no speeches. Just a hole in the frozen ground, a wooden cross, and a handful of loyal men. The Orlovskaya was finished. Without Dead, the structure collapsed. Some men fled abroad, some joined other clans, some were erased in the chaos. Moscow moved on, swallowing us whole. I survived, but survival was its own curse. I had money, power, scars, but I also had ghosts. At night I saw their faces. Kosowy, Pavel, Bear, Dead. The streets had taken them, and one day they would take me too. Now, when I walk Moscow's boulevards, I see skyscrapers of glass where blood once pooled, shiny cars where bodies once burned. The city pretends it has forgotten, but I remember. I remember every shot, every scream, every silence after. The Bratva taught me many things, that loyalty is sacred, that betrayal is death, that power always costs blood. But it also taught me something else. In this life, nobody really wins. You either die a king, or live long enough to bury him. And I buried mine. Years passed, but the shadows of the 90s never really left me. Moscow changed faster than I ever thought possible. The gray, hungry city of my youth turned into a place of glass towers and foreign cars, of millionaires sipping imported whiskey in rooftop bars. The chaos was still there, but it wore a suit now, smiled for the cameras, and spoke in boardrooms instead of alleys. The Bratva did not die, it evolved. Those who survived learned to clean their hands, to launder blood into business. The guns gave way to contracts, the street executions to corporate takeovers. The same men who once fought in muddy courtyards now sat on boards of oil companies, their tattoos hidden under silk shirts. Some became politicians, waving flags and giving speeches, pretending to be patriots while pocketing billions. The war never ended, it just changed its costume. As for me, I didn't follow them into the glass towers. I couldn't. Too much blood was on me. Too many nights of gunfire burned into my skin. I stayed in the shadows, running small operations, keeping a low profile. Money was no longer the problem. I had enough to live 10 lives. The problem was silence. The problem was memory. Sometimes I'd walk past a shiny new cafe where once we'd settled scores in blood, and I'd see only ghosts. I'd hear Kosowy's laugh, smell Dead cigarette smoke, feel the weight of the pistol in my hand. I carried their faces with me, as if the city itself whispered their names whenever the wind cut through the alleys. I tried to leave once. I took cash, went abroad, lived for a while in Spain. Sun, sea, distance. For a moment I believed I was free. But Moscow is a sickness. It pulls you back, no matter how far you run. You dream of its streets, its cold, its hunger. And when I returned, nothing had changed. Only the faces. New bosses, new pawns, the same game. In quiet moments, I wondered if Dead had been right that night at the dacha. That the Bratva was dying. Maybe it did die with him. What remained was something else. Something colder. Less brotherhood, more business. Less loyalty, more greed. One evening I found myself standing at his grave. Snow covered the earth, candles flickered, silence wrapped the cemetery. I poured a glass of vodka, left it on the ground, and lit a cigarette. "You were right," I whispered. "About all of it. The Bratva didn't survive. Only the ghosts did." The wind answered me, carrying smoke into the night. And so I live, not as a king, not as a soldier, not even as a survivor. I am a witness, A man who saw what Moscow really was in those years. A city where power was paid for in blood, where loyalty was a sentence, where life could vanish in the crack of a gun. The young don't remember. They look at the skyscrapers and call it progress. They don't see the bones beneath the concrete. They don't know that every stone, every street, was bought with lives. But I remember, and memory is heavier than any gun. When my time comes, and it will, I hope it comes fast. A bullet, a shadow, silence. Because men like me are not meant for peace, not built for happy endings. We are meant for stories, for whispers, for warnings. And maybe, when I'm gone, Moscow will finally forget me. But I doubt it. Cities never forget their ghosts.